This sure seems like a peaceful fantasy world. I sure hope there aren't any Dark Lords. Oh, but there is. Nobody remembers ancient history, but in the year 205 of the beginning era, the armies of Shadow fought the armies of Light, and the hero Alexandra slew the mighty Dark Lord Kandrakar with a blue arrow to the knee. He could lead the onslaught and adventure no more and was defeated. But he is returning. Wow, it sure was handy that I had this stock mentor character on hand that knew this highly specific piece of background information that I didn't ask for. Oh, I just sort of thought it was important. Why? Plot-related reasons? I just thought it might come up again. Delivering exposition is kind of like actually expressing that you love your sibling at their wedding. It's difficult but necessary. Welcome to part 1 on exposition, because apparently I couldn't figure out a way to deliver important information concisely and interestingly enough. So, what is exposition? Well, exposition is the contextual information required to understand the story. This can be the backstory of your characters, how your magic system works, how your villain rose to power, how the major pieces of technology in your sci-fi world work, how your state is ruled by super intelligent lemmings, where your characters are, how your city-state has an economy of pumpkins, or almost anything else. For example, in The Matrix, Neo and Morpheus sit down and we get this scene.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room, it is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch.
Now, you will often hear that exposition is bad writing, but to be clear, that is not true. Exposition is important and useful information that helps the reader understand the story and the world you've built. The exposition problem is that exposition is difficult to make logical, interesting, memorable, and believable in the context of the story. So what matters is how you communicate it. With this in mind, we can split developing exposition into 3 questions: how to communicate exposition, what information to communicate, and when to communicate it. We'll be going through the perspective character, narrative payoff, characterization, conflict, and environmental storytelling. Firstly, the perspective character. One of the big parts of the exposition problem is that half the time, the information that you're giving is something that the reader doesn't know, but all of the characters already do, or should at least. In The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare, there is a scene with some demon hunters, a demon, and the main character Clary, all in a room. Except Clary is hiding, so no one else knows that she's there, yet we still get this line. "Demons," said Jace, "religiously defined as hell's denizens, the servants of Satan, but understood here, for the purposes of the clave, to be any malevolent spirit whose origins is outside our own home dimension." This exchange leaves the reader with an awkward feeling, because none of the characters would say this because all of them already knew it. This textbook definition exposition only serves to inform the reader and nobody else. The book even acknowledges how clumsy this was in the very next line, saying, yeah, nobody needs a lesson in semantics, mate. And one of the most common ways to solve this problem of exposition is using an unknowledgeable perspective character. This is a character who knows nothing of the magic, the technology, or the world you've built, and so, just like the reader, needs everything explained to them. Think Eragon, Ellen Page in Inception, Pug and the Magician, Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, Frodo Baggins, or virtually any other fantasy sci-fi world that we loved pretending we were in when we were 12 years old. The unknowledgeable perspective character gives a logical reason for one character to communicate this exposition to the main character, and it's an easy way to inform the reader, because they would likely ask the same questions that the reader would. However, this doesn't solve the exposition problem. It's one thing to introduce it logically, but that doesn't make it interesting or memorable. In fact, it's probably one of the easiest ways to have your writing appear lazy if you're not careful. But let's talk about a really good example of the unknowledgeable perspective character. Oh, and for those who have followed the channel for a while, it is time for the obligatory Avatar reference. A major piece of exposition for the series is that 100 years ago, the Fire Nation committed genocide. They wiped out an entire people group known as the Air Nomads. For the purposes of delivering this exposition, Aang, the last remaining Air Nomad, is the unknowledgeable perspective character. This is a logical exposition delivery. He doesn't know that it happened, so Katara has to explain it to him, and the reader. But the writers frame it in a really interesting way. Throughout the episode The Southern Air Temple, Katara suggests multiple times that Aang might need to think about the idea that his people may be gone.
The Fire Nation is ruthless. They killed my mother. They could have done the same to your people.
Just because no one has seen an airbender doesn't mean the Fire Nation killed them all.
But he refuses to believe it. He insists that they're out there until he finds the skeleton of his old friend, Gyatso. In seeing this, he is consumed with grief and rage and nearly kills his friends by accident. This exposition delivery isn't just logical, but memorable and interesting, because the real focus is on Aang's trauma, not the exposition itself. There are consequences to that exposition being delivered. In fact, Katara and Sokka disagree on whether they should tell him. There are emotional dimensions to this. Aang refuses to believe it. If that information were delivered to any other character, the story would have played out very differently. Using an unknowledgeable perspective character who is personally affected by learning this exposition helps the reader care about this information. Exploring the emotional consequences of them learning this means that the character doesn't feel just like a blank slate stand-in for the reader, and it means that the delivery isn't just logical but memorable and interesting, because who it is delivered to actually affects the story. One of the common lazier forms of the unknowledgeable perspective character is amnesia, where the main character conveniently forgets every relevant piece of information. It happens in Heroes of Olympus, The Maze Runner, and the Elysium Chronicles. It's incredibly common in game sequels as a mean to hold the hands of the player as they learn the ropes again, delivering bland exposition as to how you got like this, even if the reader or player already remembers. Now, amnesia isn't necessarily a bad plot device, but it's very often used as a plot device with no other consequences throughout the story. It sure is nice that once they remember, they never forget how to fight again in the middle of battle. Boy, wouldn't that be a more interesting and realistic exploration of memory loss affecting a character, and we couldn't have that. So if you do write with amnesia, just be careful that it doesn't feel like a simple plot device to easily communicate exposition. It should be more three-dimensional than that. So how can we handle exposition otherwise? Another way is narrative payoff, making the reader work for it. It's difficult to make the reader want exposition because it's just thrown at the reader to grease the path of the main character into their adventure, explaining the magic system or the world and their place in it as the hero. It's just given to them. It's not necessarily inherently interesting. One way to circumvent this is to use exposition as payoff in the narrative by placing obstacles between it and the main character or framing it as a mystery. After all, the answer to a mystery is essentially exposition. A fantastic example of this is The Matrix. The question, what is the Matrix, is set up from the beginning, and Neo spends the first 30 minutes investigating and unraveling this mystery. He has to make a daring escape, he is interrogated by agents, and he has to have a tracker removed from him before he finally gets his answers. These obstacles and this element of mystery means that when Neo finally meets Morpheus, the exposition surrounding the Matrix feels more like a payoff to everything that has come before. Either placing obstacles in the narrative to get to the exposition or framing it as a mystery that the reader has to uncover helps the exposition feel more like a reward or payoff, because it sets up a goal in the narrative that both the character and the reader want to reach. However, this is a lot of setup for exposition, so it primarily works for the most fundamental information, that which is the unique premise of your entire story. What is the Matrix? What are the major political powers fighting over? But not all exposition is fundamental enough to deserve this kind of treatment. It would be odd to spend the first 4 chapters of the story using random obstacles as the main character tries to get home just to explain that he has 3 kids named Apple, Stalin, and Shaniqua. That probably wouldn't be as satisfying. The flip side of this is taking too long to get started. A third of your book is a long time for the reader to be patient while waiting for the world to make sense. So how do you develop these other pieces of exposition in interesting and memorable ways? Well, Blake Snyder in Save the Cat, a great book for screenwriters, offers one solution: the Pope in the pool. This is where otherwise dull information is delivered in the context of a shocking, dramatic, or humorous scene. For example, the Pope being naked in a pool. We're thinking, I didn't know the Vatican had a pool, and look, the Pope's not wearing his Pope clothes, he's in his bathing suit, rather than focusing on the information that's actually being relayed. A great example of this is in Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer. In the first chapter, Artemis confronts a fairy and demands their holy book. He explains, "You are a sprite, Pashtok, fairy, Kadalum, whichever language you prefer to use. If you know about the book, then you know about the magic I have in my fist. I can kill you with a snap of my fingers." Artemis shrugged. "I think not. Look at you. You are near dead. The rice wine has dulled your senses." In this scene, the reader comes to understand A, there is a hidden magical world, B, it's full of sprites, and C, fairies have a weakness to alcohol. Yet the focus of this dramatic scene is that the main character is essentially extorting and manipulating this weakened sprite, rather than on the exposition itself. The Pope in the Pool is a method to distract the reader from the exposition and make it easier to digest. It does this by overlaying exposition on a scene that is humorous, dramatic, or shocking. However, it's important to avoid making a scene shocking in a contrived way. It can be more effective to weave exposition to a point in the story that already needs to be dramatic. But let's break the Pope in the Pool technique down a little bit further into 3 categories: characterization, conflict, and environment. One way to deliver exposition is to contextualize it to characterization. This is one of the reasons that Harry Potter's first few chapters are so well written. Many writers know that giving a physical description of your character is difficult to make feel natural, but consider the following passage. Perhaps had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together by a lot of scotch tape because all of the times Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing that Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. The basic exposition of a physical description is only given in a context which helps better explain the emotional state that Harry is in, the setting, and how Harry is treated, with the exception of one line in the middle. He's not just small and skinny, but he is abused and being kept in a cupboard. And it's not the glasses that are described, but the reason that his glasses are broken. This way of phrasing it has emotional dimensions attached to it, so that our focus isn't on the exposition of a physical description, but on how we relate and understand Harry as a character, as a person. Knowing that he only likes this weird scar about himself tells us a lot about how Harry thinks about himself. George R. R. Martin does this all the time, for the record. He constantly adds in little backstories to families, houses, and characters, but they work because they're always done in a way that reveals more about the character at hand. We essentially learn about characters through parable. In A Storm of Swords, Jaime Lannister reads through the great deeds of Sir Barristan Selmy in the White Book, practically verbatim, but it's placed within the context of Jaime comparing himself to greater men, and coming to the demoralizing realization that he has no great deeds. Barristan Selmy's exposition is delivered, but it's used to characterize Jaime. A second Pope in the Pool strategy is through phrasing the exposition in a way that creates conflict. One example of this is in Leviathan Wakes by James A. Corey, where we find this passage. We'll get the whole package, it'll be almost as good as the real thing. The inner planets have this new biogel that regrows the limb, but that isn't covered by our medical plan. Screw the inners, and screw their magic jello. I'd rather have a good belt-to-belt fake than anything they grow in a lab. The exposition delivered here is that there are 2 human societies that have evolved. One on Earth, the jargon for them being called the inners, and one on the asteroid belt, the jargon for them being called the belters. And there is a lot of tension between these 2 groups, which is somewhat characterized by the inners being more reliant on technology. Using conflict to deliver exposition can bring out the personal beliefs of the characters, depending on who explains it. It allows the writer to naturally introduce colloquial terminology used in the story, and how that character phrases the conflict allows the author to explore how different factions are related. And finally, I saved this for last because this is the one type of exposition that most writers actually understand pretty well, because it's usually the piece of advice offered when explaining the show don't tell rule, communicating exposition through your environmental descriptions. This is essentially what's in the background. In Atonement, there is a 5-minute single-take tracking shot, which is edited for copyright reasons here, where we see horses being killed, wounded, being tended to, thousands of men on the beach, French civilians crying, soldiers praying and singing songs of hope to God, and the absolute ruin of the coastside town. This is essentially an expositional scene through which we understand that this is a war zone in World War II, they're pressed against the beaches hoping to escape, they're running out of resources, likely food, and a smart viewer could probably deduce from that alone that this is Dunkirk. Environmental exposition is also particularly effective in establishing world-building elements that you can't find natural ways to bring into dialogue. We know in Fallout there has been a history of nuclear war, from the wastes, from the gas masks left around, and the ruins. The reader will always infer things about your world when they are reading, and while other types of exposition are more explicit, such as telling the reader that the air nomad genocide happened, environmental exposition is more about what you want to let them wonder about. We can infer from the opening scene in Children of Men, when there's this explosion in the streets of London, that this is a time of civil unrest, and other such things we can often see in the background. We're never told just how bad this world has gotten, but we are left wondering what this world is like by what the writer has allowed us to see. Environmental exposition frames what the reader can infer from your story. Environmental exposition is closely tied to imagery and can communicate anything, but it's particularly effective in subtly establishing setting, tone, and elements of your world building not central to your main narrative. What's important in environmental exposition is what you choose to highlight for the reader, framing what they can infer. So what have we discussed today? Firstly, the unknowledgeable perspective character is one way to communicate your exposition logically, but that doesn't make it interesting or memorable, and amnesia often comes across as cliché and contrived. Secondly, placing obstacles and mystery between the main character and the exposition makes the exposition feel more like a payoff, as both the reader and the character want answers. Thirdly, the poke and the pull method aims to distract the reader from exposition. This can be done by placing it in a context that helps characterize, in a shocking environmental description, or in a dramatic scene with conflict. But that is all from me until part 2, because this was going to be way too long to fit all into one video, where we will discuss what information needs to be actually communicated exposition-wise, and when to communicate it, as well as a little on magic systems, because you guys love that stuff. If you enjoy my writing content, then it would mean the world for you to come help me get towards financial stability and predictability as I head into doing this full-time by supporting me on Patreon. Link down below. We have a Discord where we chat about writing and we give each other advice. It's fantastic, amazing little community. Question of the day: what is the worst example of exposition delivery you have ever seen? Let me know down in the comments below. On a side note, I'm a bit weird and I will just read exposition dumps. I know most readers don't enjoy them, but if you've followed this YouTube channel for a while, then you'll know I love lore, and sometimes that just means reading info dumps, like A World of Ice and Fire, but not everyone is like me, and it's important to understand that. Stay nerdy, Sub-Furies, and I'll see you in the future.